You know that feeling when you're at a concert or maybe just lost down a rabbit hole of old music clips on YouTube, and your eyes drift away from the lead singer? They're the center of attention, of course, the voice, the face, the engine of the whole machine. But sometimes your gaze is pulled to that other person on stage, the one who isn't singing the lead vocal, the one who isn't playing the flashy guitar solo, but who just radiates cool. They've got the look, the swagger, the effortless, magnetic charm that makes you lean in a little closer and wonder, who is that guy? For a glorious, shimmering, all too brief moment in the early 1970s, that guy, for millions of screaming fans across the globe, was Mickey Finn, with his halo of dark, unruly curls, a perpetually dangling cigarette, his ever-present conga drums, and a look that was part Mediterranean pirate, part mystical guru. He was the visual counterpoint to Marc Bolan's elfin genius in the glam rock behemoth that was T-Rex. Bolan was the star, the poet, the peacock glittering under the lights. But Mickey Finn, he was the groove. He was the handsome, silent anchor in the glitter storm. He was, in many ways, the living, breathing embodiment of the band's earthy boho chic rebellion, the human pulse that grounded Bolan's flights of cosmic fancy. But what happens when that star, the very sun around which your entire universe revolves, suddenly and violently burns out? On September 16, 1977, a tragic car crash on a quiet London street stole Marc Bolan from the world, and in doing so, it didn't just end a band. It extinguished a dream in a brutal flash of twisted metal. Mickey Finn was the survivor. He was the one who was left behind, the one who had to walk away from the wreckage of the T-Rex story while his friend and partner did not. But the question that haunted the rest of his long, difficult life and the very heart of our story today is a complex and tragic one. Did he really survive at all? This isn't just the story of a rock and roll sideman. It's a story about the devastating power of a shadow and what it's like to live your entire life basking in the warmth of its glow, only to be cast out into a harsh, unforgiving light when the source of that shadow is gone. It's a tale of dazzling, almost unimaginable highs, of crushing, anonymous lows, and of a man who was a symbol of his era, but who ultimately became a ghost long before he died, haunted by the music and the memory of a friend he could never escape. This is the story of Mickey Finn, the T-Rex survivor who was lost in the lonely aftermath. To truly understand Mickey Finn and the world that made him, you have to transport yourself back to London at the tail end of the 1960s, and you have to understand that it was a city holding its breath, a city in the midst of a strange and profound hangover. The bright pop art, amphetamine-fueled optimism of the swinging 60s, that brief, glorious era of the Mini Cooper, the mini skirt, and Union Jack everything, was starting to fade. The crisp, clean lines of the mod scene were blurring, giving way to something headier, something more mystical, and a whole lot less clean. The party wasn't over, but it had moved. It had moved from the chic boutiques of Carnaby Street and the King's Road to the sprawling, multicultural, and often dilapidated streets of West London, particularly the bohemian enclaves of Ladbroke Grove and Notting Hill. This was a different London. This was a world of smoke-filled basements and crumbling Victorian houses, of dog-eared paperbacks on Eastern philosophy and magic, of psychedelic posters that seemed to drip from the walls, and of a pervasive, sweet-smelling haze of patchouli and hashish that hung heavy over the stalls of Portobello Road Market. The soundtrack to this world was changing too. The tight 3-minute pop songs that had defined the British invasion were dissolving, stretching out into long, rambling, acid-drenched, psychedelic jams. It was an era of intense exploration, both internal and external. A generation of young people, the first to be born after the trauma of the Second World War, were rejecting the stiff upper lip conformity of their parents. They were embracing a new, nomadic, and often impoverished lifestyle built on a foundation of peace, love, and cheap rent. This was the London of the underground, a loose-knit community of artists, poets, radical thinkers, and musicians who weren't necessarily chasing a record deal or a spot on top of the pops. They were chasing a vibe, an authenticity. They were painters, sculptors, and dreamers living on the dole, launching underground magazines like Oz and International Times, and creating for creation's sake in clubs that felt more like communal art experiments than concert venues. Places like the UFO Club and Middle Earth became legendary sanctuaries for this new counterculture. Places where the lines between audience and performer blurred into a single pulsating psychedelic experience. Michael Norman Finn, the man who would soon become Mickey, was a perfect product of this exact scene. He wasn't a musician by trade. He wasn't a graduate of any prestigious art college. He was a face, a talented decorative painter, a motorcycle enthusiast, a man who had absorbed the hippie ethos completely. He was, in essence, a professional hippie, a man whose currency wasn't his technical skill, but his look, his attitude, and his innate, effortless cool. He was part of the fabric of the underground, a quiet but noticeable presence. Meanwhile, another, far more restless face in that same crowd belonged to a musician named Marc Bolan. At this point, in 1969, Bolan was already a minor deity of the underground scene. He was the fey, warbling, acoustic half of a psychedelic folk duo called Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were the darlings of the cognoscenti, championed by the legendary and hugely influential BBC Radio 1 DJ, John Peel. Their music was a strange, beautiful, and often impenetrable brew of Tolkien-esque fantasy, Celtic mythology, and acoustic guitar played with a trembling, almost fragile intensity. Bolan's voice was a unique instrument, a quavering, ethereal bleat that sounded like a mystical sheep lost in a magical forest. They were a beloved cult act, playing to small but utterly devoted audiences of students and fellow hippies who would sit cross-legged on the floors of folk clubs, mesmerized by Bolan's otherworldly songs. But Marc Bolan was deeply, furiously ambitious. He was tired of being a cult hero, tired of playing to small rooms of polite stationary fans. He had visions of true, screaming teenage pop stardom dancing in his head. He craved the fame, the adoration, the sheer, unadulterated thrill of being a pop idol. He knew with a certainty that bordered on arrogance that his whimsical folk act had a ceiling. He felt a change in the air, a shift in the cultural wind. The gentle, acoustic, introspective vibe of the hippie dream was about to be blown away by something louder, simpler, sexier, and a lot more fun. He had the songs percolating in his brain. He had the unique, charismatic voice, and he possessed a star quality that was almost blinding. But his musical partner at the time, the gifted but erratic percussionist Steve Peregrine Took, was a man deeply, almost fanatically, committed to the anarchic, anti-commercial spirit of the underground. Took wanted to play free festivals, to give the music away, to be a voice of the revolution. Bolan wanted to be on the cover of a teen magazine. Their partnership was fracturing under the weight of these opposing philosophies. The final straw came during a disastrous American tour, where Took's increasingly wild behavior and embrace of hard drugs made it clear that their journey together was over. Bolan returned to London, knowing he needed to make a change. He needed a new partner, but he wasn't just looking for a musician to keep the beat. He was looking for a co-star. He needed someone who looked the part, someone who could stand beside him on stage and complete the visual picture of the rock and roll god he intended to become. He needed someone who looked like the music he wanted to start making. Beautiful, a little bit dangerous, and impossibly devastatingly cool. He needed, though he didn't yet know his name, a quiet, handsome painter and hippie from the Grove named Michael Finn. The collision of these two figures, both born from the same small, smoky, and creatively fertile scene, would create a spark that would ignite a whole new era in British music, the glittering, androgynous, and utterly glorious age of glam rock. Before the glitter, the top hats, and the screaming hysteria, there were two young men from very different corners of London, both searching for a way out. Their eventual partnership would seem on the surface like a perfect fit, but their paths to that fateful meeting in 1969 were starkly different, and those differences would define their entire relationship. Marc Bolan, born Mark Feld in Hackney, East London, was ambition personified. He was a man in a perpetual state of becoming. From his earliest days, he knew he was destined for stardom. The only question was how. As a teenager in the early 60s, he was a face, a sharp-suited mod who was a minor celebrity in his local scene, known more for his immaculate clothes and stunning looks than for any particular talent. He tried his hand at being a model, his androgynous beauty landing him in a few catalogs. He recorded a series of folk pop singles under the name Toby Tyler, attempts to cash in on the Bob Dylan craze that were met with complete indifference. He even did a brief explosive stint as the guitarist in the proto-punk band John's Children, a chaotic outfit known more for their on-stage violence and exhibitionism than their music. Every attempt was a dead end, another lesson in failure that only fueled his desperate hunger for success. It was only when he stripped everything back, picked up an acoustic guitar, and reinvented himself as the mystical, mythology-obsessed Marc Bolan of Tyrannosaurus Rex that he found his first taste of acceptance. But for a man like Bolan, the adulation of a small cult was never going to be enough. It was merely a stepping stone. By 1969, he was a man possessed by a vision of a new kind of sound, a sound that would marry the simplicity of 1950s rock and roll with his own unique, fantastical lyrics. He was ready to go electric. He was ready to be a pop star, and he was utterly alone. On the other side of the city, Michael Norman Finn was living a life that was, in its own way, just as dedicated to a certain aesthetic, but without any of Bolan's burning public ambition. Born in 1947 in Thornton Heath, a working-class suburb in South London, Finn was not a man who seemed destined for the stage. He was handsome, certainly, with sharp features and an intense gaze, but he was also quiet and unassuming. He fell in love with art and the bohemian lifestyle, finding his spiritual home in the burgeoning hippie scene of West London. He became a decorative painter, a craftsman whose work was deeply intertwined with the psychedelic movement. He painted intricate, flowing murals on the walls of trendy boutiques in the King's Road and adorned the newly fashionable apartments of the in crowd. It was a life lived on the fringes, a world of artistic expression and personal freedom, far removed from the pressures of the mainstream music industry. He was a well-known face in the underground, a man respected for his artistic talent and his laid-back, effortlessly cool demeanor. He had a passion for motorcycles, a love for the open road that seemed to stand in stark contrast to the often insular, navel-gazing world of the psychedelic scene. He was a man of action in a world of dreamers. Music, for him, was a source of joy, not a career path. He loved the primal, immediate thrill of rhythm. He would play bongos and congas at parties and informal jams, his playing simple and untechnical, but always deeply felt, always locked into the groove. He had no illusions of becoming a professional musician. It was simply a part of the life he had chosen, another form of expression alongside his painting and his motorcycles. And so, in the autumn of 1969, these two worlds were about to collide. Marc Bolan, freshly returned from a disastrous American tour and having just fired his musical partner, was in a panic. He had gigs booked for his duo, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and he had no one to play with him. His manager, scrambling, put the word out through the tight-knit community of the underground. Marc Bolan needs a conga player, urgently. The story of what happened next has been told so many times, it has taken on the quality of a myth, but its essence remains a perfect snapshot of the era. A friend of a friend heard the call and thought of the quiet painter who was always tapping out rhythms on something. A phone call was made. Mickey Finn, likely thinking it was just a chance to earn a few quid for a couple of gigs, agreed to meet this strange elfin folk singer he knew only by reputation. The meeting took place at Bolan's flat. It was, by all accounts, a typically bohemian space, small, cluttered with books on mythology and magic, smelling strongly of incense, with exotic fabrics draped over the furniture. Bolan, with his intense bird-like stare, sized up the tall, handsome painter who stood before him. This wasn't an audition in the way a musician would understand it. Bolan wasn't listening for technical proficiency or complex polyrhythms. He was looking. He was casting. He saw the sharp cheekbones that could cut glass. He saw the magnificent cascade of dark curls that fell around Finn's shoulders. He saw the leather jacket, the quiet confidence, the look of a man who had lived a little, who wasn't going to be easily impressed. Mickey Finn didn't look like a folk musician. He looked like a rock star. He looked like the other half of the image Bolan was trying to build. Bolan handed him a set of bongos. "Just follow me," he said, and launched into one of his strange, meandering songs. Finn, who had probably never heard the song before, did exactly what he was told. He found the pulse, the simple, hypnotic beat that lay at the heart of Bolan's cosmic waffle. He didn't play anything flashy. He played a simple, steady, repetitive pattern, a heartbeat. Bolan stopped. He looked at Finn for a long moment. He had found him. He had found the cool, silent, handsome anchor that his flamboyant, talkative, pretty boy persona needed. He had found his Ringo, his Keith Richards, his foil. "The job's yours," Bolan said, as if bestowing a great honor. "We've got a gig on John Peel's radio show tomorrow." Mickey Finn, the painter and motorcyclist, was likely stunned. A gig on John Peel's hugely influential show was a major event in the underground. He had gone to an informal meeting for a temporary gig and had walked out as the new member of one of the scene's most beloved bands. In that moment, Michael Finn, the painter, began to fade into the background. He was now Mickey Finn, the new other half of Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was a partnership based not on years of shared musical history, but on a single electrifying moment of aesthetic recognition. Bolan had found his man, and the stage was set for a revolution. But neither of them could have possibly imagined the tidal wave of fame, adoration, and eventual tragedy that this unlikely partnership was about to unleash upon the world. A spark had been struck in that small, incense-filled room, but a spark is not yet a fire. The partnership between the mystical poet and the quiet painter was new, untested, and fragile. Before they could conquer the charts and define a generation, they first had to learn how to be a band. Their journey from the smoky folk clubs and Peel sessions to the bright, unforgiving lights of Top of the Pops was not instantaneous. It was a period of intense creative evolution, a transformation that would see them shed their psychedelic folk skin and emerge as the glittering electric beast the world would come to know and adore as T-Rex. The partnership between Marc Bolan And Mickey Finn was, from its very first moments, a study in contrasts. Bolan was a whirlwind of nervous energy, a man whose mind seemed to operate on a different frequency to everyone else's. His conversation, a rapid-fire torrent of mystical pronouncements, half-formed poetic ideas, and sudden searing insights. Finn, on the other hand, was a pool of calm. He was a listener, an observer, a man who spoke little but whose presence was a powerful grounding force. Thrown together by chance and Bolan's aesthetic whim, they had to forge a working relationship in the most public of ways, live on the radio. Just a day after their first meeting, they found themselves in a sterile BBC studio for John Peel's hugely influential program. For Finn, it must have been a surreal, head-spinning experience. Days earlier, he had been a painter concerned with the price of turpentine and the logistics of getting his motorcycle fixed. Now he was sitting opposite a man hailed as a subterranean genius, with a legendary DJ on the other side of the glass, about to perform live to a national audience of discerning music heads. He played with a simple, intuitive grace, his hands a steady rhythmic whisper beneath Bolan's strange, beautiful songs. He didn't get in the way. He added texture, a human pulse, and on the airwaves it worked. The new Tyrannosaurus Rex was born. Their first album together, 1970's A Beard of Stars, is a fascinating document of this transitional period. It is the sound of a band and a man in the process of a profound metamorphosis. The whimsical, sometimes twee elements of the earlier folk material are still present, but a new energy is crackling just beneath the surface. For the first time on an album, Marc Bolan is playing an electric guitar. It's not the roaring, swaggering Les Paul sound that would soon define him. It's a sharper, more angular sound, but it's a clear statement of intent. And anchoring this new, more muscular direction is Mickey Finn. His percussion is no longer just a folksy flourish. It's a solid driving foundation. You can hear the beginnings of a groove, the first hints of the primal boogie that would soon conquer the world. The album was a critical success within the underground scene, but it wasn't a commercial breakthrough. It was, however, the sound of Bolan shedding his psychedelic skin, and Mickey Finn was the steady hand helping him to do it. On stage, their visual chemistry was becoming their most potent weapon. They were a perfect, almost archetypal pairing. Bolan, the diminutive corkscrew-haired shaman, lost in his own lyrical cosmos, and Finn, the tall, dark, handsome presence beside him, a figure of worldly cool. He was the rock that tethered Bolan's mystical kite to the ground. He didn't need to be a virtuoso. His job was to look magnificent, and he did it effortlessly. But Bolan's ambition was growing more ravenous by the day. He knew that the name Tyrannosaurus Rex was a mouthful, a relic of the hippie era he was so desperate to leave behind. In a moment of pure marketing genius, he shortened it. The new name was simple, punchy, and iconic: T-Rex. It sounded less like a whimsical creature from a fantasy novel and more like a rampaging, unstoppable force of nature. It was a declaration that the days of sitting on toadstools were over. The era of the electric warrior was about to begin. The song that would serve as the band's calling card, the shot that would be heard around the world, was a strange and magical little thing Bolan had written called Ride a White Swan. It was a perfect bridge between his past and his future. The lyrics were still filled with his signature mystical imagery, pagan goddesses, ancient trees, and swan-back journeys. But the music was something new. It was built on a simple, unforgettable, descending electric guitar riff and a steady, hypnotic beat. To this, Bolan and his producer Tony Visconti made an inspired and, at the time, deeply unfashionable choice. They added a lush, soaring string section. In an era when serious rock music was moving away from such pop accoutrements, it was a bold, almost defiant move. The record was released in the autumn of 1970 with little fanfare. Initially, it was met with a shrug. Radio programmers didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't folk, it wasn't hard rock, it wasn't pop in the traditional sense. It was its own unique hybrid creature. But then a funny thing happened. The kids started requesting it. It began to build a momentum of its own, a true word-of-mouth sensation bubbling up from the streets. The BBC, sensing a shift in the wind, cautiously added it to their playlists. For Mickey Finn, this period must have been one of slowly dawning wonder. Imagine hearing the song you played on, a song created in a small London studio, suddenly crackling out of a transistor radio in a greasy spoon cafe, or booming from a jukebox in a pub. Imagine seeing your band's new abbreviated name creeping week by week up the official UK singles chart. The song was a slow-burning phenomenon. It entered the charts in October and stayed there for months, climbing higher and higher, a steady, inexorable ascent. By January of 1971, it had peaked at number 2, held off the top spot only by the novelty juggernaut Grandad by Clive Dunn. Tyrannosaurus Rex, the cult folk duo, was dead and buried. T-Rex, the pop phenomenon, had been born. And Mickey Finn, the hippie painter and percussionist from Thornton Heath, was suddenly, bewilderingly, a bona fide pop star. His face was in the teen magazines. His name was being read out on the radio. And his life was about to change forever. The success of Ride a White Swan was not a fluke. It was a catalyst. It was the proof of concept that Bolan needed, the confirmation that his pop instincts were right. It opened the floodgates, and what poured out was an almost superhuman burst of creativity, a string of hit singles and albums that would not only define the era, but would give birth to a whole new genre of music. Bolan knew that to conquer the charts, the two-man setup was not enough. He needed a proper band, a powerhouse rhythm section that could translate his new electric boogie sound to the massive stages he now intended to play. He recruited Steve Curry, a solid melodic bass player, and Bill Legend, a powerful no-nonsense drummer. T-Rex was now a proper four-piece rock and roll band, a sleek, muscular machine built for maximum impact. In February 1971, they released their follow-up single, Hot Love. It was a more confident, more swaggering beast than its predecessor, a pure, distilled slice of pop perfection built on another indelible guitar riff and a chorus that was impossible not to sing along to. The song shot straight up the charts, and the band was invited to perform it on the BBC's flagship music show, the institution that was Top of the Pops. An appearance on Top of the Pops in the early 70s was a monumental event. It was the one show that the entire nation, from teenagers to their grandparents, sat down to watch every Thursday night. It had the power to create superstars overnight. The band knew this was their moment, their coronation. The performance they were about to give would become one of the most iconic and influential in the history of popular music. But the truly revolutionary act happened before they even played a note. In the dressing room before the show, Bolan was getting ready. His girlfriend and stylist, Chelita Secunda, was with him. In a moment of pure, spontaneous inspiration, she suggested a final touch to his stage outfit. She took a small pot of glitter and playfully dabbed 2 shimmering teardrops under his eyes. It was a simple, almost childlike gesture, a bit of fun. But on national television, under the bright, unforgiving studio lights, it was a cultural detonation. When Bolan stepped onto the stage, a starburst of glitter sparkling on his cheekbones, it was a revelation. It was androgynous, it was beautiful, it was theatrical, and it was utterly, completely captivating. The kids watching at home slumped on their beige sofas in the dreary, post-60s gloom of a British winter, were mesmerized. They had never seen anything like it. It was a flash of otherworldly magic, a permission slip to be different, to be glamorous, to escape. The next day, cosmetic counters in Boots and Woolworths across Britain were sold out of glitter. A cultural movement had been born in a 2-minute performance, and T-Rex, with Marc Bolan as its glittering archangel and Mickey Finn as his dark, handsome acolyte, were its undisputed, untouchable kings. Hot Love went to number 1 and stayed there for 6 weeks. The phenomenon that the press dubbed T-Rextasy had begun. For the next 2 years, T-Rex were arguably the biggest band in Britain, sparking a level of fan hysteria not seen since the Beatles. Their lives became a relentless, exhilarating whirlwind of hit singles, sold-out concerts, and screaming, fainting teenage fans. At the center of this hurricane stood the two faces of the band. Bolan, the creative genius, was now fully embracing his pop god persona. He was wrapped in feather boas and satin jackets. His corkscrew hair, now a magnificent, untamed mane. He was giving witty, outrageous interviews, proclaiming himself a modern-day poet and the voice of his generation. But beside him, a crucial part of the visual spectacle was Mickey Finn. While Bolan was the light, Mickey was the shade. He cultivated a more rugged, mysterious bohemian look. He would wear velvet jackets, flowing scarves, and often a magnificent wide-brimmed top hat, looking like a gypsy king or a character from a 19th century romantic novel. He was the dark, brooding presence to Bolan's bright, elfin light, the quiet, cool to Bolan's flamboyant heat. While Bolan wrote the songs, sang the vocals, and played the searing, instantly recognizable guitar riffs, Mickey's role in the new electric T-Rex was just as crucial, though far more subtle. On the monumental albums of this period, 1971's Electric Warrior and 1972's The Slider, his congas, bongos, and assorted hand percussion were an essential ingredient in the band's unique sound. They added a funky, organic texture, a rhythmic spice that set T-Rex apart from the more straightforward stomp of their glam rock rivals like Slade or The Sweet. Listen closely to a classic like Get It On, Bang a Gong. Beneath the driving beat of Bill Legend's drums, you can hear Mickey's congas, a subtle but vital layer of rhythm that gives the song its irresistible, slinky, hip-swiveling groove. But his most important contribution was, and always had been, visual and chemical. He was the perfect foil. On stage, he would stand behind his congas, a cigarette often dangling from his lips, exuding an aura of detached, almost regal, cool. He would rarely smile, but would watch the chaos unfolding before him with a look of bemused tolerance, occasionally stepping up to the microphone to sing simple, effective backing vocals in his low, understated voice. He was the anchor of the spectacle, the still point in the turning, glittering world. He made the whole fantastic enterprise feel grounded, feel real. He was also, in this period of intense, isolating fame, Bolan's most trusted confidant. He was Bolan's right-hand man, the one who had been there before the hysteria, the one who understood the journey from the smoky folk clubs to the sold-out arenas. Their friendship was the bedrock of the band's classic lineup, while bassists and drummers were, in Bolan's view, somewhat interchangeable. Mickey was family. He was the one who could handle Bolan's notoriously large and fragile ego, the one who could calm him down before a big show, the steadying presence in the eye of the hurricane. The absolute pinnacle of their fame and the most enduring document of their unique partnership came in 1972 with the release of the T-Rex concert movie, Born to Boogie. The film was directed by a man who knew a thing or two about fan hysteria, Ringo Starr. It's a surreal, joyous, and often gloriously messy document of T-Rextasy at its peak, capturing the band's legendary concerts at the Wembley Empire Pool, where they played to a sea of ecstatic, screaming teenagers. But the film's most memorable and revealing sequence takes place far from the roar of the crowd. It features Mark and Mickey, dressed as characters from Alice in Wonderland's Mad Hatter's Tea Party, sitting down for tea on the immaculate lawn of John Lennon's Tittenhurst Park mansion, where Ringo was living at the time. They are surrounded by a string quartet, a group of bemused nuns, and Ringo himself acting as a kind of surreal master of ceremonies. It's a moment of pure, whimsical absurdity that perfectly captures the playful, almost childlike spirit of the era, and more importantly, the unique, almost brotherly bond between the two men at the center of it all. They are two friends living out a shared, impossible dream. It is the image of a band and a friendship at the absolute apex of its power and innocence. They seemed untouchable, a magical duo destined to ride their white swan forever. But in the fickle, fast-moving world of pop music, forever is a dangerously short amount of time. Two friends living an impossible dream, the band and the bond at their apex, seemingly untouchable. But in the fickle, fast-moving world of pop music, forever is a dangerously short amount of time. The very hysteria that had lifted them to such dizzying heights was, by its nature, unsustainable. The screaming teenagers would grow up, musical tastes would inevitably shift, and the bright, innocent glitter of 1972 would begin to fade into the cynical, hungover reality of the mid-70s. For T-Rex and for Marc Bolan, the descent from the summit would be as rapid and chaotic as the climb had been magical, and for Mickey Finn, it would be the beginning of the end of the only dream he had ever truly known. In the dizzying, supercharged world of pop music, the view from the top is always spectacular, but it is also terrifyingly precarious. For T-Rex, the years 1971 and 1972 were a sustained, blissful peak. They were the undisputed kings, a phenomenon of screaming teenagers, #1 hits, and sold-out concerts that seemed as if it would last forever. The concerts at Wembley, immortalized in Ringo Starr's film Born to Boogie, were their coronation, the moment they ascended from pop stars to rock and roll royalty. For Marc Bolan, it was the fulfillment of every fantasy he had ever harbored. For Mickey Finn, the quiet painter from Thornton Heath, it was a surreal and beautiful dream he had stumbled into, a life of unimaginable excitement and adoration. But the one unavoidable law of pop music is gravity. What goes up must eventually come down. And the one unavoidable law of a phenomenon built on the tastes of teenagers is that those tastes are brutally, relentlessly fickle. The very things that make you the sound of right now are the things that will make you sound like yesterday in 6 months' time. As T-Rex entered 1973, they were still a huge band, but for the first time, tiny, almost imperceptible cracks were beginning to appear in the glittering facade of their empire. The descent would be slow at first, a gentle, almost graceful loss of altitude, before it became a terrifying, uncontrollable spiral. The first sign that the cultural weather was changing came from the music itself, the joyful, simple 3-chord boogie that T-Rex had perfected was starting to sound, well, a little bit simplistic. The musical landscape was evolving. On one side, you had the progressive rock behemoths like Yes and Pink Floyd, creating complex album-length sonic tapestries. On the other, the heavier blues-based rock of bands like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple was dominating the stadiums. And bubbling away in the underground clubs of London and New York, the raw, aggressive 3-chord fury of punk rock was beginning to take shape. In this new, more serious, and often more cynical musical environment, the whimsical star child poetry and glam rock pantomime of T-Rex was beginning to feel, to the influential music press and older rock fans, a little bit juvenile, a little bit silly. Bolan, a man with an astute antenna for the shifting zeitgeist, felt this change more keenly than anyone. He knew he had to evolve or die. His attempt at evolution was the 1973 album Tanks. It was a darker, denser, and more musically complex record than its predecessors. Bolan was experimenting with new sounds, incorporating the soulful backing vocals of American singers, jazzy saxophone breaks, and even the eerie tones of a mellotron. It was an ambitious album, and it contained some of his most underrated work. But for a large portion of his fan base, the kids who had fallen in love with the simple joy of Get It On, it was a confusing and slightly alienating departure. The album was still a hit, but it lacked the world-conquering swagger of Electric Warrior or The Slider. For the first time, a T-Rex single, the brilliant 20th Century Boy, failed to reach the top spot, stalling at number 3. The Imperial phase was over. For Mickey Finn, this period of musical transition must have been a strange one. His role had always been to provide a simple, primal, rhythmic foundation. As Bolan's musical arrangements became more complex and layered, with the addition of backing singers and session musicians, the space for Mickey's organic, intuitive percussion began to shrink. He was still a vital part of the live show, the visual anchor, but in the studio the creative process was becoming more and more centered on Bolan and his producer, Tony Visconti. The real problem, however, was not the music. It was the man making it. The pressures of superstardom were taking a devastating toll on Marc Bolan. The playful, ambitious elf king of 1971 was slowly being replaced by a more paranoid, arrogant, and isolated figure. His abuse of cocaine and alcohol escalated dramatically. The drugs, which had once been a creative stimulant, were now becoming a crutch, a way to cope with the crushing anxiety of having to constantly top his own monumental success. His physical appearance began to change. The once rail-thin, androgynous beauty was gone, replaced by the bloated, puffy face of a man living a life of serious excess. His famously untamable curls were often limp and greasy. He became a more erratic and tyrannical bandleader. His legendary ego, once a charming part of his pop star package, now curdling into something darker and more difficult to be around. The atmosphere within the band, once a joyous gang of mates on an incredible adventure, became tense and strained. The fun was draining away, replaced by the grim business of maintaining a machine that was starting to sputter. Mickey Finn, ever the loyal friend, was caught in the middle of it. He was watching his best friend, the man who had given him this incredible life, beginning to lose his way both personally and creatively. It's not hard to imagine Mickey, a man who had always been more of a laid-back hippie than a driven rock star, feeling a growing sense of disillusionment. The party was starting to feel long, and the hangover was setting in. The year 1974 marked the point of no return, the moment the slow decline of T-Rex accelerated into a full-blown crisis. Bolan, in a desperate attempt to reignite his creative spark and chase a sound that was more in line with his new heroes of American soul and funk music, made the album Zinc Alloy and the Hidden Riders of Tomorrow. He even ludicrously subtitled it A Creamed Cage in August. It was a sprawling, cocaine-fueled, and often incoherent mess. The hooks were gone, the simple boogie replaced by rambling, overproduced funk workouts. For the vast majority of his old fans, this was the final straw. The album flopped, and the singles released from it barely scraped the charts. This commercial failure was compounded by a series of devastating personal and professional blows. The The first, and arguably the most significant, was the departure of his longtime producer, Tony Visconti. Visconti had been more than a producer. He was the co-architect of the T-Rex sound, the man whose brilliant arrangements and steadying studio presence had helped to shape Bolan's raw genius into perfectly polished pop gems. Their partnership had been one of the most successful in rock history. But by 1974, Bolan's erratic behavior and musical self-indulgence had become too much for even the patient Visconti to handle. He walked away, and with his departure, the magic of the classic T-Rex sound was gone forever. The next to go was the drummer, Bill Legend. Worn down by the endless touring and the increasingly toxic atmosphere within the band, he quit. The classic four-piece lineup, the band that had conquered the world, was now down to just two of its original members, Bolan, the increasingly isolated king, and Mickey Finn, his loyal but weary second in command. They struggled on, touring with hired musicians, playing to smaller and smaller crowds in venues that were a far cry from the sold-out stadiums of just 2 years earlier. The hysteria of T-Rextasy had completely evaporated, replaced by a kind of nostalgic curiosity. For Mickey Finn, this must have been a profoundly dispiriting experience. He was a man who had never actively sought the spotlight, who had simply been swept up in his friend's incredible journey. Now he was left to navigate the wreckage. The end of his time in T-Rex, when it came in early 1975, was not a dramatic headline-grabbing blowout. It was a sad, quiet, and almost inevitable parting of the ways. The friendship between him and Bolan was strained, the musical connection was gone, and the joy of playing had long since vanished. The consensus is that it was a mutual decision, a weary acknowledgement that the dream was well and truly over. Mickey Finn, after 5 years as the co-pilot of one of the wildest rides in rock and roll history, simply walked away. His departure marked the definitive end of the classic T-Rex era. For Bolan, it was the final severing of ties with the past. He would eventually become a tax exile, moving abroad to escape the UK's punitive tax laws, and he would spend the next 2 years in a creative and personal wilderness, largely forgotten by the public that had once adored him. For Mickey Finn, life after T-Rex was a harsh and immediate reality check. He tried to find work as a session musician, but he was not a technical player, and his style was too closely associated with a sound that was now deeply unfashionable. He was Mickey Finn of T-Rex, but T-Rex as a viable commercial entity no longer existed. He found himself in his late 20s, a famous face with no real career, a man whose entire identity had been wrapped up in a band that was now a part of history. For the first time since he had walked into Marc Bolan's flat 6 years earlier, he was on his own. It was the beginning of a long, slow fade into the shadows, a quiet struggle for identity and purpose that would prove to be the most difficult battle of his life. Just as the world had written him off, Marc Bolan, in the spring of 1977, began to stage one of the most remarkable comebacks in British music history. The catalyst for his rebirth was, ironically, the punk rock movement. While many of the old guard of rock stars were openly disdainful of the raw, aggressive energy of punk, Bolan embraced it. He saw in the young punk bands a kindred spirit, the same kind of rebellious do-it-yourself energy that had fueled his own early career. He became an unlikely godfather to the movement, championing bands like The Damned, whom he took on tour as his opening act. He had shed the excess weight, kicked his heavy cocaine habit, and seemed to have found a new creative fire. He formed a new, leaner T-Rex lineup and released an album, Dandy in the Underworld, which was hailed by critics as a stunning return to form. And most significantly, he was back on television. He was given his own 6-part music show simply titled Marc, on which he would perform his own songs and showcase new, up-and-coming bands like The Jam and Generation X. He was witty, he was charming, and he looked fantastic. He was a star reborn, poised for a magnificent second act. Rumors even circulated that he was talking about reuniting with Mickey Finn and the classic T-Rex lineup. For Mickey, watching his old friend's triumphant return from the sidelines must have been a complex and bittersweet experience. There would have been a sense of joy for his friend's renewed success, but perhaps also a pang of regret, a feeling of having been left behind. Then came the night of September 16th, 1977. Bolan had spent the evening out for dinner with his partner, the American soul singer Gloria Jones. After the meal, they were driving home in Jones's purple Mini 1275 GT. She was at the wheel. As they approached a humpback bridge in Barnes, South London, the car suddenly veered out of control. It left the road, careened across a patch of grass, and slammed sideways into a steel-reinforced sycamore tree. Gloria Jones was severely injured, but she would survive. Marc Bolan, who was in the passenger seat, was killed instantly. He was just 2 weeks shy of his 30th birthday. The news of his sudden violent death sent a shockwave of grief and disbelief through Britain and the music world. It was the end of a comeback story that had just begun, the silencing of one of rock and roll's most unique and beloved voices. Tributes poured in from all over the world. David Bowie, his friend and glam rock rival, was said to be devastated. The fans, the ones who had screamed for him at Wembley, were heartbroken. The Electric Warrior was gone. For Mickey Finn, the news must have been a blow of unimaginable force. It wasn't just the death of a former colleague or a famous acquaintance. This was the death of his best friend, the man whose life had been inextricably intertwined with his own for the better part of a decade. It was the death of the man who had plucked him from obscurity and given him a life beyond his wildest dreams. It was the final, brutal, and irreversible end of the T-Rex story. Any faint hope he may have harbored of a reunion, of recapturing the old magic, was extinguished in that moment of screeching tires and twisted metal. He was now officially a survivor. But he was the survivor of a dream that was now a memory, the keeper of a flame for a light that had been violently put out. The shadow he had lived in for so long, the shadow of Marc Bolan, had vanished. And Mickey Finn, at just 30 years old, was left completely and utterly alone in the dark, facing a future that was a terrifying empty blank page. Marc Bolan's story, for all its tragedy, was now complete. It was a perfectly formed rock and roll myth, sealed by a sudden poetic death that ensured he would remain forever young in the public imagination. But for Mickey Finn, the story was not over. In fact, a new, much longer, quieter, and far more painful chapter was just beginning. This is the story of the aftermath, the tale of the survivor. It's a journey into the long, lonely decades that followed the crash, a search for purpose in a world that no longer had a place for him, and the quiet human tragedy of a man left to grapple with the ghost of a life that was larger and ultimately more brilliant than his own. The funeral of Marc Bolan was a media circus, a national outpouring of grief for a fallen pop idol. The biggest names in rock, like Rod Stewart and Ringo Starr, gathered to pay their respects, while others like David Bowie sent their condolences from afar. Thousands of heartbroken, glitter-streaked fans lined the streets, weeping openly for the Electric Warrior who had provided the soundtrack to their teenage years. In the midst of this chaotic public mourning stood Mickey Finn, a man whose private grief was so immense, so foundational, that it was almost invisible to the outside world. The world had lost a star. Mickey had lost his anchor, his partner, his purpose, and his best friend. As the headlines faded and the music industry moved on to the next sensation, Mickey Finn was left to confront a terrifying and deafening silence. For the better part of a decade, his life had been a whirlwind of frantic, joyous activity, every day dictated by the needs of the T-Rex machine. A recording session to get to, a TV show to film, a flight to catch, a stadium to play. Now the phone stopped ringing. The diary was empty. The party was definitively, brutally over. In the immediate years following Bolan's death, he tried to navigate a world that no longer seemed to have a place for him. He was still Mickey Finn, a face instantly recognizable to millions, but the context that gave that face meaning was gone. He attempted to find work as a session musician, hoping his rhythmic talents and famous name would open doors. But the musical landscape of the late 1970s was a foreign country to him. Punk and new wave had taken over, and these new aggressive genres had little use for the subtle, funky textures of a conga player from the glam rock era. His style, his look, his very essence were inextricably linked to a sound and an era that was now considered a nostalgic, slightly embarrassing memory. He was a man out of time, haunted by his own glorious past. The financial realities of his new life began to bite, and bite hard. The money from the T-Rex years, which had seemed so limitless during the champagne-soaked days of success, was not a bottomless well. A life of rock and roll excess is an expensive one, and for a sideman, a non-songwriter, the royalty checks were never as substantial as the public imagined. He found himself in his early 30s, a man who had experienced the pinnacle of fame, now facing the mundane, terrifying prospect of having to start over from scratch, with no real qualifications outside of being the handsome guy who played bongos in a legendary band. It was in this crucible of grief, professional frustration, and profound personal dislocation that his personal demons, which had always been present but largely kept in check by the structure of the band, began to take over. He fell into a deep and lasting depression, a quiet, gnawing sadness for a life and a friend he had lost, and he began to self-medicate that pain with the one thing that was always readily available in the rock and roll world: alcohol. The drinking, which had once been a part of the celebratory, hedonistic lifestyle of a pop star, became something different. It was no longer about having a good time. It was about numbing the pain, about quieting the memories, about filling the vast, empty hours of a life without purpose. He was becoming a ghost, a familiar face seen propping up the bar in London pubs, the man who used to be Mickey Finn. By the early 1980s, a new nostalgia-driven economy was beginning to emerge in the music world. A generation of fans who had grown up in the 70s were now adults, and they yearned to reconnect with the music of their youth. This created a touring circuit for the bands of yesteryear, an opportunity to get back on the road and play the old hits to a receptive, if smaller, audience. For Mickey Finn, a man adrift, this was a potential lifeline. It was a chance to get back to the only thing he really knew how to do: be on a stage and play the music of T-Rex. He began playing gigs with other musicians, performing the classic songs. This eventually evolved into a more permanent touring entity when, in 1997, he co-founded the band that would be known as Mickey Finn's T-Rex. It gave him a purpose again. It gave him a livelihood. It put him back in front of an audience, a place where he still felt a flicker of the old magic. For many fans, these shows were a pure, unadulterated joy. They were a chance to sing along to 20th Century Boy, to dance to Telegram Sam, to hear the songs they had grown up with, played live by a man who was an authentic living link to Marc Bolan. The concerts weren't about breaking new ground. They were about celebration, about keeping the memory and the music alive. For a new generation of fans, those who had been too young to witness the original phenomenon, it was the closest they would ever get to experiencing the energy of T-Rextasy. In this context, Mickey was not a substitute for Bolan. He was a custodian, the keeper of the flame, an honorable tribute to his fallen friend. However, to a significant and very vocal portion of the T-Rex purist fan base, and to some members of Bolan's own family and estate, the very existence of a band calling itself T-Rex without Marc Bolan was anathema. It was seen as something close to sacrilege. Their argument was simple and to them absolute. Marc Bolan was T-Rex. He wasn't just the lead singer. He wrote every word, every note. He was the visionary, the creative engine, the very soul of the band. To them, any band performing under that name without him was, at best, a glorified tribute act, and at worst, a cynical and exploitative cash-in, a shameless attempt to profit from a dead man's legacy. This created a painful and often public rift that followed Mickey for the rest of his career. He found himself in an impossible no-win situation. On one hand, he was a working musician trying to earn a living in the only way he knew how. On the other, he was constantly being accused by a faction of the most hardcore fans of tarnishing or even betraying the memory of his best friend. The irony was devastating. Mickey Finn, the man who had been the symbol of loyalty and steadfast friendship within the band, was now being painted as a traitor. The debate also reignited the old arguments about his actual musical contribution to the band in the first place. Critics who had long dismissed him as little more than a pretty face on the bongos saw his post-Bolan career as the ultimate proof. He wasn't writing new material. He was just replaying the old hits. It was seen as a confirmation that he had no musical identity of his own. But this argument, then as now, misses the fundamental, almost magical point of what made T-Rex so special. They were never a band of chin-stroking virtuosos. They were a band built on charisma, style, and a kind of joyful, primitive sexual energy. Mickey Finn's simple metronomic percussion was the perfect foundation for that energy. He wasn't a technically complex player, but he was a player with an incredible, undeniable feel. He was the groove, he was the cool, and in the alchemical formula of a great rock and roll band, sometimes the cool is just as important as the chord changes. The reality of his life during this period was a far cry from the glittering days of T-Rextasy. The nostalgia circuit is a hard, unforgiving grind. It's a world of long, overnight drives in a cramped van, of cheap hotels, of sound checks in half-empty clubs. It was a life lived a million miles away from the limousines and sold-out arenas of his youth. And it was a lifestyle that was dangerously conducive to the alcoholism that had now taken a firm grip on his life. He was a man performing a celebration every night on stage, but he was living a tragedy off it. The 1990s saw Mickey Finn continue to tour with his version of T-Rex, a familiar and beloved figure on the European festival and club circuit. But the years of hard living and relentless touring were catching up with him. The once impossibly handsome and vibrant man began to look his age and more. Friends and bandmates became increasingly concerned about his drinking, which was no longer a social habit but a visible, debilitating illness. His health began to seriously decline towards the end of the decade. Years of heavy, chronic alcohol abuse had taken a devastating toll on his internal organs. He was diagnosed with severe and irreversible liver and kidney problems, conditions that required constant medical attention and made the rigors of life on the road almost impossible to sustain. His final years were a sad, quiet cycle of hospital stays and brief periods of fragile recovery. He was a frail shadow of the powerful, charismatic figure he had once been. The glitter was long gone, washed away by decades of grief and alcohol. He was no longer a rock star. He was a sick man, fighting a losing battle against the accumulated damage of a hard-lived life. On January 11, 2003, Michael Norman Finn died in a hospital in Croydon, South London, from kidney and liver failure. He was 55 years old. His death did not make the front page news. There was no national outpouring of grief, no televised tributes. For the most part, the world that had once been mesmerized by him barely registered his passing. It was a quiet, sad end for a man who had once stood at the very center of a deafening cultural storm. The ultimate contrast, of course, was with the death of his friend. Marc Bolan's tragic, violent death at 29 had immortalized him, freezing him in time as a rock and roll legend, forever young, forever beautiful, forever glittering. Mickey Finn's fate was, in its own way, much crueler. He was forced to grow old, to watch the world forget, to live for a quarter of a century with the ghost of his own glorious past. He was the survivor who was ultimately a casualty, a man who survived the crash but was consumed by the long, quiet, and lonely aftermath. So what is the legacy of Mickey Finn? Why does his story, the story of the sideman, still resonate and matter? On one level, his legacy is permanent and secure within the visual iconography of the 1970s. Any documentary, any book, any television montage about the glam rock era is incomplete without his image, the wide-brimmed top hat casting a shadow over his handsome face, the cascade of dark curls, the cool, detached gaze from behind his congas as chaos erupts around him. He was a style icon, a quiet pioneer of the bohemian aesthetic that has been endlessly recycled in fashion and music ever since. He was and is the epitome of a certain kind of rock and roll cool, but his deeper, more human legacy is as a cautionary tale. His story is a powerful, poignant, and ultimately heartbreaking examination of the symbiotic and often brutal nature of fame. He is perhaps the ultimate archetype of the sideman, the man whose entire career, identity, and fortune is dependent on the singular, brilliant, and often unstable star at the center of the stage. His life asks a difficult and uncomfortable question. What is the human cost of being the other guy? He gave his youth, his image, his loyalty, and his very identity to Marc Bolan's vision. And in return, he was given a life of incredible adventure, adoration, and financial reward. It was a pact that worked beautifully as long as the visionary was still there. But when Bolan was gone, Mickey was left with a suitcase full of memories and nothing of his own to build a future upon. He had no songs, no solo project, no plan B. His entire life had been plan A. Be the guy standing next to Marc Bolan. His story is a profound warning about the dangers of living entirely in someone else's shadow, of allowing your own light to be completely extinguished by a brighter one. He was a man who seemed to have it all, but in reality he was a tenant in a beautiful house that he never owned. And when the owner died, he was left out in the cold. In the end, the story of Mickey Finn is one of profound and beautiful contradictions. He was a bona fide rock star who was not, by his own humble admission, a great musician. He was a quiet, gentle, and easygoing man who became a key visual symbol of a loud, decadent, and flamboyant era. And he was the celebrated survivor of a famous tragedy who ultimately succumbed to his own long, quiet one. He wasn't the genius, he wasn't the poet, and he didn't write the songs that made the whole world sing. But to dismiss him as a mere footnote, as a lucky, handsome face who is in the right place at the right time is to fundamentally misunderstand the alchemy of what makes a great band and a moment in time truly magical. T-Rex was never just about the music. It was about the feeling, the look, the attitude, the sheer, joyous, sexy spectacle of it all. And Mickey Finn was an essential, irreplaceable part of that spectacle. He was the cool heart that beat beneath the glitter, the steady human hand that grounded the electric storm of Bolan's genius. His life is a poignant reminder that not all casualties of rock and roll happen in fiery crashes or dramatic headline-grabbing overdoses. Some happen slowly, quietly, in the lonely and forgotten years that follow the applause. They happen in the struggle to find an identity when the one the world gave you is suddenly and irrevocably taken away. He was the man who stood beside the sun, and for a while he shone with a brilliant, beautiful, reflected light. But when that sun went out, he was left alone in the cold, a fate that is, in its own quiet and human way, one of the most tragic rock and roll stories of them all. He deserves to be remembered not just as the sideman, but as the silent partner in a magical dream, a man whose quiet grace and effortless cool helped to define a generation.